expand your mind, and enrich your world. It's time for another outstanding podcast from ICRT.
Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk. I'm Keith Manconi. Working as a foreign correspondent with the excitement and the travel, it's a dream job for many, maybe just short of astronaut or pastry chef. But today's guest is one of the few who has actually lived it, as a Taiwan-based freelancer covering stories all over Asia. One problem, though, his start in journalism coincided with the collapse of print media, meaning that as he was busy making a career, the industry was busy just trying to stay afloat and slowly reinventing itself. Jonathan Adams saw the whole fiery mess from right here in Taiwan, and he wrote about the experience in his new book, Welcome Home Master, covering East Asia in the Twilight of Old Media. I spoke with him recently. Jonathan Adams, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you came to Taiwan in 2004 as a stringer for Newsweek and doing some copy editing work for the Taipei Times. And over several years, you managed to put together, a good living as a freelancer, working for a number of international publications. But I hope this is no spoiler for your book. You are not a foreign correspondent now. You're working for the U.S. State Department. And your book kind of goes into some of the frustrations that you had with kind of the whole industry and the constraints that were on your work and things you could do and things you couldn't do. But I want to back up to maybe the whole beginning. When you came here about a decade ago, did Taiwan seem like a promising place to start a career in international journalism?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, it actually ended up coming to Taiwan on the recommendation of several people, including editors back in New York. I'd been working in Newsweek in New York at the time. And, a lot of people said, look, Taiwan is an underreported story. There's a lot going on there. There's obviously the big cross-strait story that everybody's interested in, but also a big business story, the high-tech industry in Taiwan. And just a great place where people are friendly. It's easy to talk to. You don't have some of the limitations in other places in Asia that you might have. So absolutely, I thought it's a great place not only to start freelancing and learning a little bit about this part of Asia, but also for learning Mandarin Chinese, which was one of my goals.
Right, but one of the things that you write about in the book is this term, the Taiwan ghetto. You had some colleagues that were warning you that if you got in too deep, you might just be associated as the Taiwan guy, and people would think that you couldn't really cover anywhere else in the world. But you stuck around despite that. Was there something here that was drawing you that made you want to cover this for a long period of time?
Well, actually, yeah, the Taiwan ghetto reference that I put in the book was from, I believe, after I'd been here for a year covering news from Taiwan. I went back to New York to kind of check in with my editors there. And actually, it's interesting that you bring that up because that comment really reflects kind of the old media mentality of an organization, a big magazine like Newsweek. Because the way it used to be done was, you might get your start in a place like Taiwan, but there was a lot more mobility than within an organization like Newsweek. You were then kind of expected, if you were ambitious, to move on to a bigger bureau. For example, one of my predecessors at Newsweek, who was a stringer in Taiwan, went on to become Beijing bureau chief, then Tokyo bureau chief, and finally Hong Kong bureau chief. All his housing was subsidized, a really nice package.
They took care of him.
They took care of him. And, these were very competitive jobs. That wasn't easy. I'm not in any way suggesting it was easy in those days to get those jobs, but it was a different mentality. So that comment really was indicative of that. There was a feeling, don't stay in one place too long. You need to move around to be successful. And I think with the whole change to this sort of new media model, that's one of the things that's really changed. That old model of moving around from bureau to bureau doesn't really exist anymore, or it happens a lot less frequently.
And, during your reporting work, you did work in China for a little bit. You definitely filed a lot of stories from Beijing and other parts of China. But I think the bulk of your work was writing stories about Taiwan. So was there something, and you cover in your book that, there was more demand for a lot of those stories out of Beijing. But, you were still trying to sell Taiwan stories. So was there something about Taiwan that kept you coming back?
Yeah, well, I think eventually it was the kind of freelancing opportunities I had that kept me here. I had worked for a summer at the Newsweek bureau in Beijing. And that's kind of what you're referring to, just this night and day change from the attitude of editors in New York. China was hot, China's sexy, we can't get enough China, please send us stories. I had more than I could do in a very small bureau in Beijing. Filing from Taiwan, on the other hand, is like, sort of seen as a marginal. I had to work to sell it. So I think if that had continued, that obviously was a frustration. There was very little, as they said, real estate in the magazine to begin with. My primary employer was Newsweek at that time. It's hard to get mention of a place like Taiwan into Newsweek. So that would have become more and more frustrating. So what kept me here was really the opportunity to freelance for other papers and media outlets. A variety of them. I did Christian Science Monitor, a little bit for International Herald Tribune. But the one that really, I think, kept me here and got me into doing the stories that I was most interested in doing was Global Post. So this was a new internet-only website that was focused on global news for an American audience. Mm-hmm. And I think it was one of the first employer I had as a freelancer that, to me, really got it, understood the dramatic impact that the internet was having on print and magazine media in particular, newspaper and magazine media, and was adapting to that with an internet-only website. And this was just a fantastic opportunity, and it kept me, I think, going here. And actually not only kept me going, but I think that when I look back, those were my fondest days, as I recall them, as a journalist here, because I could really write about anything. They were open to everything from politics, economics, culture, arts, the whole gamut. They wanted something different every week. So as I say in the book, I was kind of off the leash. That's how I felt like before in the old media model, particularly with a place like Newsweek. You constantly have to think of how does it relate to the big news? How do you play off the big news? You can't write about something. Very difficult to write about something unless there's a news peg, as they called it. And it was also very difficult to write something that didn't kind of fit into the very specific writing formulas that a publication like Newsweek had. So Global Post is wide open.
Right. And you also wrote about, beyond just the format there, another frame that they kind of imposed was what you call the country frame that every country kind of faces. There's only a certain kind of story that editors are looking for any given country. And for Taiwan, you say most of what it is tech industry stuff or cross-strait stuff. We want to know, are things heating up in the cross-strait? Right. How's our tech industry stuff doing? If it's something that doesn't fall into that, people aren't really interested.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's a comment that I actually heard in grad school from, he was then an international editor for the Associated Press. Used that phrase in one of his lectures to us, and it really stuck with me. He called it breaking the frame. And he used that phrase to describe what he thought the mark of a good foreign correspondent was. And it's not easy to do, but he talked about how every country you report in has a narrative that people get kind of fixated on. And for Taiwan, for example, there's always a concern, is Taiwan going to declare independence? Are they going to start some kind of war between the U.S. and China? Once you actually get here, you tend to find out a lot of those narratives are exaggerated. Some of them are kind of too often repeated. And so this AP editor really suggested, what you really, the mark of excelling as a correspondent is to try to break that frame. Get out of that narrative, pursue other narratives, other kinds of stories that people aren't as used to hearing. And so I really try to keep that in mind, particularly when I had the freedom to do so, working for other publications like Global Post.
What would you point to as a couple of examples of stories that you managed to cover that kind of broke that frame?
One of them, I would say, I did a long project right before I left Taiwan on the Shija trio. This was a death penalty case, double murder from 1991. And it was an ongoing case. It's not something that I could have written about for a publication like Newsweek. There was no news peg. But I wanted to spend the time to do kind of what some people call longitudinal reporting, look at the same people and go back and follow the same case over months. So I think it was at least, I don't remember, 7 or 8 month process where they were having these hearings. I was doing other projects along the way, of course, but I followed this case. I got to know some of the lawyers associated with the case, some of the civil society groups that were also associated with. And I met the Shija three themselves, including Su Jianhe, who is really probably the most outspoken and vocal of the three. And this is just an incredible story, incredible human drama. He described to me how he had basically lived through years of facing death, facing the death penalty, and including a short period of time when the order could have come down any day. And so just listening to talk about this and talk about how, talk very matter-of-factly about how this changed his views toward the death penalty, saying, hey, this could happen to anybody. And then how he said, it was very moving, really stuck with me. He said, he had basically a negotiation with God particularly in those days when the execution order could come any morning. He said, look, if I survive this, I'm going to dedicate my life and career to human rights causes and human rights issues. So that story and following that story was, not only just kind of very personally rewarding. These people, I thought, the defense lawyer team was really impressive. But I thought also really illustrated something about Taiwan that was worth kind of exploring. And it was really about, to me, it really showed one of the ways that Taiwan's civil society plays such an important role, particularly since the days of, the post-martial law era and going to democratization. Because what you had with these defense lawyers and all these civil society groups who had come together to really behind these three, and they were a cause. And I think that's something that, when you talk about kind of going back to the idea of breaking the frame, it's not as sexy a topic perhaps as cross-strait war. But the incredibly important role and this incredibly important, vibrant civil society in Taiwan as kind of really an engine of social development and political development here, I think is really one of the real stories of what's happening here. Right,
that kind of the development of still a very young democracy and the course that's taking was something that you focused on a lot in your reporting. What do you think? What kind of an impact were you hoping for this to have for a foreign reader? I mean, when they came across this, at least seemingly very local story, perhaps only familiar to Taiwanese folks, what were you hoping for them to take away from reading that?
Well, I guess I would say that when I was working on a project like that, I wasn't really thinking in those terms. I'd say, I was really just trying to tell a story, thinking of how to craft a lot of material into hopefully a readable narrative. But I guess, ultimately it's just your hope that the reader will be left with a better understanding of what makes a place like Taiwan tick. What are the important social institutions? What are the important trends? What makes this place different than others? And then also, what are the commonalities? Because I think you really do learn a lot in sort of this comparative, comparing how Taiwan system is developed with some of the very similar issues in the United States. For example, I mentioned briefly in that long story the Innocence Project in the United States and how they've shown great numbers of people through DNA evidence. They've been able to show that they were wrongly convicted and in many cases even put to death.
So it's a similar set of issues that are faced by countries around the world.
Yeah, that's right. I think some of the editors I really respected and really had a sense that, and they were trying to encourage you not to think of these different countries as little boxes that you kind of don't interact much and you just report on this box over here and that. Instead, think of more broader themes. We tried to do that a little bit in some of the Newsweek reporting, cutting across Southeast Asia, and also reporting from Taiwan on various social issues. And I thought that was one of the more interesting approaches. You don't want to get stuck in this mentality of you're kind of just reporting on this little box here.
This geographic segmentation. These countries have more in common than we maybe think they would. Just switching gears just a little bit. So one of the things that your book goes into is the way that the industry is changing and how it's becoming more and more difficult maybe to find steady work as an international journalist. But there's still international journalism going on. We still see a fair amount of that happening. So what exactly is changing? What are we losing? What is the old model that's going away? and what is it maybe being replaced with?
Right. Well, I think the change in being a foreign correspondent is really just a piece of a much broader story and trend, and that is the dramatic disruption of particularly the magazine and newspaper industries by the internet. Their old advertising-based business model simply doesn't work anymore. So it's a piece of that story. When I wrote this book, I went back and took a look at the state of the media reports that are published by the Poynter Institute. In 2014, they actually put a number for the first time on what effect this disruption had on newspaper and magazine jobs. They counted 54,000 jobs lost between 2003 and 2013. Happened to be about the exact same time period of when I was a foreign correspondent based in Taiwan. They tried to say there's sort of a silver lining. There were 5,000 new jobs created in new media sites like Huffington Post, Global Post, BuzzFeed. But that's kind of tells a story itself. Of the dramatic change is really internal to the industry. It's about the lack of a viable career path and just fewer jobs.
So if I'm a consumer of media, maybe I'm not so worried about all these journalists losing their jobs, but maybe I am more worried about the fact that the kind of coverage that I can expect to get is probably changing. What would you say to that set of readers? What is going to be changing for them? What kind of coverage should they be expecting?
Yeah, well, I talk about this a little bit in the conclusion to my book. I don't see it as all a negative story, that somehow now we're not going to be able to understand other countries or foreign affairs at a time when we most need it, age of globalization and so on. I think there's certainly, until that people can find a new business model, there will be fewer jobs. But as a consumer of international news, I think you also have more diversity than ever. There are more people than ever writing, and it's all available on the internet. Both foreigners coming to a place like Taiwan, but also locals writing about their place, writing about their own countries and their own issues that they care about. One way I would put it is, I think for a correspondent now, you have more freedom, but less impact. And the more freedom now, again, it's sort of almost the blog mentality. As a blogger, you can write about anything. There are some paid jobs, like the one I had for Global Post, where you're able to write about things that would never have fit into the old media narratives or a publication like Newsweek, but less impact.
Right.
In the old days of old media, you were kind of had a megaphone.
Right.
You could speak authoritatively about the big news in a place like Taiwan. Now there's just this cacophony of voices, so many diverse voices on the internet, it's hard to be heard.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of blogs.
A lot of blogs and just a lot of outlets out there.
But then I maybe this would be interesting for some of our listeners, who are interested in journalism. I mean, the barrier for entry is lower, and you can get involved a lot more easily. You can be a part of this international coverage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in some ways, when I talk about there being less jobs, it depends on how you look at it. Yes, there are less stable jobs that enable you to support a family,
right,
for example.
Give you perks.
Help you with your housing, help set you up in a place. Fewer comfortable jobs and fewer jobs with mobility throughout the organization, like the old Newsweek model. But there are actually more opportunities if you're that 20-something, or in my case, I was a 30-something when doing it from Taiwan, and you're not so concerned about making a lot of money. Maybe you don't have to worry about supporting a family. If you have that flexibility, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. It's easier now to pick up stakes, just move to a foreign country and start to get to know the place, start pitching stories while maybe working other part-time jobs. This is something that you can do much more easily now.
And I want to just, maybe this is taking things in too much of a philosophical direction, I don't know. But when we just think about the impact that this kind of journalism has, I want to look at this from two sides, both from the perspective of people living in Taiwan and on the side of the consumers. What do you think is the impact of the kind of work that you were doing and the kind of work that you're hoping journalists working in this new media model will do? What difference does this make for the people that are reading it and for the people that are being covered? Does it make any difference for folks in Taiwan if people in America have a better understanding of a trial that's going on or some festival that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I always struggle with this. One thing I talk about in the book is this constant sense that we never knew who our readers were in many cases, what impact they were having. That changed a little bit with, comments through the internet, but most comments on your typical story
You get a little strident.
are not very enlightening or
Right.
Necessarily very interesting, the type of people who tend to comment. So, and I don't think it was necessarily representative view of people who are actually reading your story. So very hard to tell. I mean, that's one thing you struggle with. I think for me as a foreign correspondent, I just focused on doing my job, trying to tell a story, and I had a great time doing it, particularly with the feature writing, which I most enjoyed. But you would hope that, again, we do have this vast reservoir of information now. Many of my stories, not all of them, are still on the internet, can still be found by people who proactively have an interest in Taiwan. I think it's more about that now. It's the students back in the United States or elsewhere who's doing trying to find out more about Taiwan, and one of them might stumble across maybe an article I wrote or one of my colleagues wrote, and hopefully get a better understanding of somebody who's on the ground here, from somebody who's on the ground here about this place. So yeah, you hope that some of this will have an impact. I think the reality is that was one of the frustrations I had, and it's like it is one of the perhaps drawbacks of new media. I think there's such a cacophony of voices now. There's so much on the internet. There's so many people blogging.
It's hard to sort.
It's again the old days that were not necessarily better, but in this respect, you had like a megaphone. You could really be heard as a correspondent, authoritatively speaking, or in theory, authoritatively speaking about a place. And there's simply too many voices now. You're drowned out. It's very hard to be heard. So again, I think it's not so much about one correspondent or writer having an impact, but you're just contributing to the conversation. And I think hopefully it's of some value, particularly those people who are out there proactively looking for information on a place like Taiwan.
All right. Well, we'll have to continue to seeing how all this coverage goes. We've been speaking today to Jonathan Adams. The book is Welcome Home Master, Covering East Asia in the Twilight of Old Media. It is available on Camphor Press now. Jonathan Adams, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
You can learn more about the book at campherpress.com. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. For Taiwan Talk, I'm Keith Manconi.